Good afternoon, everybody. So welcome to our first meeting of 2026. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Ann Dinkle, and I'm the president of the club at the moment. Somebody wants the job. We have elections coming up in April, so I'm just putting it out there. So do we have any new members or first-time attendees today? Wow, quite a few. Welcome. Thanks for coming. So reminder that membership resets this month. So if you haven't renewed already, please do. And you can do it online, or Kristen would be more than happy to take your money now. Another reminder is that we will be holding elections for various positions in April. You all know Rob Bly, who has organized our field trips for the last, what, Rob, 7 years? At least? Okay. So he's planning to step down from his position. So that'll definitely be open. I'd like Rob to come up and talk a bit about what that position entails.
So I plan and often lead the field trips for Sussex Bird Club, which I think is the best part of the club. We go out birding every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or once a month, depending upon the season. And I put together many spreadsheets full of places to go and times that we've gone in the past, which I'd be more than happy to share with whomever takes over in the future. I would also share with that person the descriptions that I use to send out to announce the field trips, which identify where we're going, how to get there, what birds we might see, and that sort of thing. So I would like to continue, but I'm being forced to retire by my dear wife, who says I've done it long enough, or she's done it long enough. How's that? In any case, I'd be happy to work closely with anyone that would like to assume that responsibility going forward. We're not going to be here that much between now and then, but I'll stay until the new elections.
Thank you. Okay. And on behalf of the Bird Club, Rob, I'd like to thank you for all those years of your hard work. Okay. Treasurer's report is we've given $1,475 in donations to various bird-related or habitat conservations, I guess, this last year. And I'm going to turn it over to Nancy to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. Yeah, I'm going to stick through 2026 because I have 2026 already booked. But if anyone has any interest in doing what I do, I've been doing it for 5 or 6 years now. I would be happy to co-do it and then pass over. But for now, I'm still pretty happy doing it. John, I'm glad you're here today. I'm glad the Eagles are playing at 4:30 because I think we'd have a lot fewer people. But just an update, the Buffalo Bills 10, Jacksonville 7. So we don't have to worry about that and we can listen to John. But on our next meeting will be February 8th here at 2 o'clock. And we're going to have Ashley Kendi speak. She is the tick biologist for DENREC, and that's what she's going to talk about, ticks in Delaware and what we can do as birders to keep ourselves and our yards maybe a little more safe. But many of you may remember John spoke for us in 2020, and he has a long career working in many museums. History is his is his jam. And when he last year said, Nance, why don't we do this? I thought it was a great idea to just kind of marvel in the history of birders. And who would think Bronx County, New York? But John, thank you for speaking for us, and come on up.
Thank you, Nancy. As a former colleague of mine used to say, of all the introductions I've had, that is the most recent. So it's a pleasure to be here. I was supposed to do this talk back in November, but I had some medical issues, and I appreciate Nancy's and the club's understanding and rescheduling. And the good news is it's a better talk because of that. I've had more time to think about it, and at any rate. And before I get started, I have a couple of acknowledgments. First of all, I want to acknowledge my dear wife, Lynn, who is my lifelong birding partner, also a historian and museum professional, and best of all, a terrific editor. And this talk has been greatly improved by her skills, I can say so. Secondly, I want to acknowledge somebody I've gotten to know quite well, Susie Hickey Nels. That's her with her father, Joseph Hickey, who you'll hear more about. I contacted Susie back in 2012 when I first became interested in this topic and reached out to her to see if she had any of her father's papers. And we began corresponding, and indeed, she sent me an entire carton of stuff, minutes of the Bronx County Bird Club, correspondence, notebooks, photographs. Those 6 boxes you see there are my rehousing. I was also trained as an archivist, so I put them into archival folders, and they are now at the University of Wisconsin. But Susie has just been a godsend. And I learned as recently as last week that there's yet another carton of material winging its way to me. So Susie, I know you're listening and you've rounded up a number of your friends. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. So let's go on. Introducing the Bronx County Bird Club. How many of you have heard of the Bronx County Bird Club? Okay. What do you know about it? Okay. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Well, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of bird clubs today. Back in the 1920s and 1930s, there were even more. It was kind of the heyday of bird clubbing, and the Bronx Club is an example of that. But I don't want to dwell too much on that for the moment, but I want to introduce you. If you've read anything about them, if you've read anything about the Bronx County Bird Club, you may have run across this article by John Farrand. It's a really nice article, and that illustration there, I think, it certainly stayed in my mind the first time I read it. And it's a nice illustration, shows these boys dressed in nice clothes, birding together, having a good time. It's not necessarily the most correct image. For one thing, the Bronx County Bird Club boys really didn't go birding together all that much. They went individually, they went maybe with a couple of other members. It was not like this club going out to with Rob on a field trip or wherever they would go. So that's one thing. Here are images of as many of them as I could find. These are as close to about 1925 as I could get. Allan Cruickshank, John Kersey, Richard Kersey, Joseph Hickey, Richard Herbert, John Metazuski, Irving Cassoy, and a couple of others that I couldn't get photos of. These are at the time of the Bronx County Bird Club were individuals in their late teens, and I want to start then with that. They came from a range of different life histories and diverse experiences from all over the Bronx. You can see High Bridge, Hunts Point, other places. And that's important because they tend to be treated in the literature as if they're all of a piece, but their life experiences shaped who they were and the legacies that they left. This is just a quick chart that I've begun putting together of what they did, the high schools they attended. Just to give an example of differing experiences, Allan Cruickshank went to Evander Child's High School with 4,000 students. Joe Hickey went to a high school with 5,000 students. On the other hand, the Kersey brothers went to a prep school with about 125 fellows. Their father was a prestigious Wall Street attorney. So there's a disparity of experiences there. And just to set the scene, imagine the Bronx going from north to south in kind of a curve. These are images from around this time of North and West Bronx neighborhoods with single-family homes and open spaces. And by contrast, the South Bronx, still very rural, very polluted in some areas. Sanitation was not good. You see actually the picture on the lower right, a farmer with a horse. He's actually plowing in his backyard. And you see a subway stop there. It's a very different experience. And one of the people who grew up there, actually his family, he was born in Harlem and moved from Harlem to the Bronx around the time this picture was taken. Joe would have been about 7. They moved to the Bronx because the rents were much cheaper there, and settled in an area near Hunts Point. They lived in a one-room house. Imagine that. Here's a photograph of him with some of his little pals. As it says, we called it the Little Valley of Peace and Gossip. They used to get together and roast potatoes, and then they would go birding. And they didn't have any field guides. They would climb trees and sit there and wait for warblers and other birds to come visit them. But again, you get this sense of it's just a rugged area in a sense, kind of impoverished. And as he says, as teenagers, they started looking for birds, and they got hold of a copy of Chester Reed's Pocket Guide, and they also found a battered copy of Birds in New York and ripped out the pages and put together a field guide. Those are actually Hickey's own copies. And, that's how they did their birding. And then when Joe was about 14, he joined the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts had a bird study merit badge, and the Scoutmaster, Basil Hall, became kind of his mentor, taking them out, him and other friends of his, out on field trips. And there's a photograph, a wonderful photograph. This is one of the ones from Susie. I should say most of the photos, I think all the photos of Joe Hickey are from Susie. So again, thank you. But this wonderful photo of Joe meeting his Scoutmaster, re-meeting him in 1973. It's one of the places that Hickey and his young friends and other birders went to. The Bronx Zoo was centrally located, and it was a real magnet. People of all ranks of life, all ages of life would come there largely to go birding. There was a great hall of birds. There was an outdoor aviary, and it became a gathering spot. In fact, outside the aviary house was a bulletin board where they would post the latest sightings. So Hickey and his friends would go there. And in particular, they would go to Lake Agassiz and the woods surrounding the Bronx Zoo because they're teemed with birds. And it was there that Hickey and his friends started meeting other friends their age from other parts of the Bronx. Joe also talked about going to the American Museum of Natural History. I had a gifted childhood in the sense that I had access to such a thing as the American Museum of Natural History. Fantastic collection of birds, a library that anybody could go visit, curators who, for the most part, were pretty accessible. And it was also the place where the Linnean Society of New York met. In a little tiny room, you see the little square there up on the 4th floor. This was the second oldest bird society in the United States. And its member met twice a week, or twice a month rather. There were only about 10 rows of chairs in the meeting room. We boys always sat in the back on the right. We were at the very bottom of the peck order. So you imagine these boys, now teenagers, 16, 17, coming in and having a group kind of like this, made up of curators at the museum, former presidents of the American Ornithologists Union. Theodore Roosevelt had been a member at one point. It was very, in some ways, very elite. This photograph kind of suggests that. And it's a wonderful quote from Hickey about there was a time in the past when half its presidents had been presidents of the American Ornithologists Union. This was an index to the stature of the American Museum's Department of Ornithology and its contributions, but somewhere in the 20s and 30s, we practically ran out of museum senior citizens. And what that did was open up the door to some younger people coming in particular this man, Warren Eaton, who became president in 1931. He was the first businessman elected to head the society, which by this point was made up increasingly of businessmen who in their spare time would go birding on the weekends, and then they would come together and join the Linnean Society and attend their meetings. Well, one of the people that they got to know at the Linnean Society and at the museum was this man, Ludlow Griscom, who some of you may have heard of, a genius at field identification. He used his encyclopedic memory for field marks to identify birds. He was regarded as the leading bird watcher of his time. If you had any questions about identification, you would contact Ludlow Griscom. He had that stature, that eminence. And he had the ability to distinguish birds on the basis of identifying diagnostic marks without shooting them, which was normally the way you'd identify a bird. You would shoot it and then be able to figure out what it was. He identified on the basis of sight. And he felt and believed very strongly that you could identify just about every bird in the field, with a few exceptions. So in 1923, Griscom published this book, Birds of the New York City region. It's kind of a combination field guide and guide to where you could find birds. And as Hickey said, it focused the attention of Hickey and his friends on the Linnean Society and so forth, focused their attention on the potential of birding in the New York region, and they decided to form their own small bird club. And they met in the attic of the Kersey's house in West Bronx, had their first meeting in November 1924. You see their names, all this is from the minutes of the meeting. And although the minutes don't really say this, their purpose was pretty much this: beating Ludlow Griscom at his own game and counting the most birds. And they were very competitive. These young guys, they were competitive amongst themselves. They were competitive amongst other birders. And they got together and they began strategizing about ways to do a Christmas bird census, what is now known as the Christmas bird count. How many of you have gone on a Christmas bird count? You know how it's done today? You get together and you decide what teams are going to go where, then you go out and you do the field work and you come back and you all do the tallies. Well, back in the mid-1920s, it wasn't done like that. It was unusual, if really unheard of, for teams of birders to get together. Usually it'd be one or two people going out, and then they'd come together and meet other people and they'd do the tallying. So the Bronx County Bird Boys decided we want to beat them. And so they did a couple of things. They installed bird feeders at strategic locations throughout the Bronx region, number one. Number two, they divided up into teams and they assigned each team an area to survey in advance. Remember, these were high school students, so they had time on their hands that the business guys didn't. Secondly, third, staff each team with at least one person familiar with the birds of that area and with a track record of ID experience. So Joe Hickey down on Hunts Point knows ducks. Let's have him go down there. Allan Cruickshank, he goes out to Van Cortlandt Swamp. He knows rails and gallinules. Let's get him there. So that kind of thing. Spend up to 2 months' time prior to the count making intensive surveys of areas known to be frequented by birds and listing what species. So they put together the checklist. We're going to find this and this and this. And then determine how much time should be spent in a given area and actually plot it out. We're going to spend 5 minutes here. We're going to spend 10 minutes here. And so what happens? So they form their teams, and you see here the different areas that they go to, and have their first count on December 28th. And they do well. They get 49 species. When the mark of 35 was reached, the excitement attained a high pitch. And when the grand total was found to be 49, everyone was amazed and at the same time overjoyed. They go on to say the club had an excellent chance to turn in the highest census for the Northeast, and that the total, 49, would long represent the high water mark of Christmas birds in Bronx County. So they're pretty proud of themselves, except they didn't beat Griscom. But the following spring and in the fall, they started going out aggressively going after Grissom's book. Grissom's book listed arrival and departure times for different birds, and it had tables, and it broke them down into groups, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on when they arrived and the likelihood of what you'd see at any given time. So they take that information and they go out and they start trying to find birds where Ludlow Griscom said they would be, and they want to find them, but they also want to find more than he had, or find them at different times than he had. And so they start going again to some of their favorite spots, Hunts Point, Clausen's Point, Van Cortlandt Lake, and so forth. And they did well. They actually beat his record in a number of cases. Well, again, the time rolls around for the next bird census. This is December 27th, 1925. A brutally cold day. Temperatures at the start 10 below with a 10 above, but with wind chills was probably about 10 or 20 below, steady wind. It had snowed. The guys go out. They talk about the winds being gale force. With considerable surprise that the total was found to be 67 birds. They didn't bother counting house sparrows because those were considered to be trash birds, but they got 67 species, almost a third more than what they had gotten the first time around. And more than that, not only did they beat Griscom, they became the second highest total in the United States. Out of the 200 returns that were put in, the Bronx County Birders were the second best in the country. So a pretty amazing thing for a group that had been in existence for a little over a year, and it was basically a group of kids. So Hickey, bear with me here, has a wonderful description of how these guys went about what they did. And I'm not going to read. This is a letter to his former scoutmaster in 1926. He's talking actually about the following year's count. But he said the Christmas census boom started in the Bronx at the end of October. And by November 1st, the Bronx County Bird Club's intensive pre-census campaign was well underway. Weekly trips up to the Botanic Gardens showed the catbird and fox sparrow would linger around the club's feeding station. And at the old Arctic was a sure bet. Cassoy, Herbert, and I went up to Mamaroneck and rye every Sunday, and so made sure of killdeers and green-winged teal, which arrived in a duck pond in Rye Park on November 28th and has been there ever since. Cruickshank's regular trips to Van Cortlandt Swamp netted him a rusty, some cowbirds, and some flickers. The Kerseys located a string of goshawks at Pelham and Classen Point. It was great astonishment that they found an American bittern in a swamp at Classen on December 25th. So they go out, and they get another great total. They're disappointed because some of the birds they hoped to see weren't there. But that's how they operated. And their goal was ultimately to reach 100 birds. They weren't quite able to do that, and the problem was they kind of beat themselves at their own game because they set an example for the other bird clubs in the area to start competing against them. And actually another group from Barnegat beat them, getting 107 species. So at any rate, they continued in that vein for some time. And as Hickey says, field ornithology, meaning listing, is now our most favorite pastime. Every Sunday finds us out on a hike to some favorite locality. They're hoping to get lists of 200 species or more. And so that was what they were all about. In 1927, while some of them were out birding, they met a fellow who was an art student from outside of Buffalo, New York, a man named Tory Peterson, who bragged so much about the birds that he had seen back in his hometown of Jamestown that they started referring to him as Tory Jamestown Peterson. And they let him into the club, even though he wasn't technically a native of the Bronx. They realized he was an expert birder, and so they allowed him to join the club. And he had remarkable expertise, and he showed his prowess at identifying the very birds that Grissom had said couldn't be identified in the field, particularly gulls and sandpipers and warblers. And so Peterson is out with the members of the Bronx County Bird Club, birding with them, showing them how to identify these different species. And suddenly, in November 1927, Grissom leaves. He heads off to Cambridge to take a position as curator with the Museum of Comparative Zoology. And Hickey says, "Can you imagine the loss we, the younger generation, feel? I don't suppose the old-timers mind as much as we do, but LG certainly was the greatest single help and inspiration the BCBC ever had." Nobody knows quite why Grissom left. I think it's because they were beginning to beat him at his own game, particularly Peterson. And I think Grissom, who was a very, not a very humble person, didn't want to be upstaged by these young birders anymore. And so he left. Well, once Grissom's gone, the Bronx County birders kind of lose their momentum. They continue meeting on a sporadic basis, but as the minutes here show, our reports will be late. The usual discussion upon which all meetings at this time end up concerning itself. Nothing was very definitely decided upon. The usual argument is whether we should include the whole region was duly engaged in. They couldn't decide anything. There's a sense that they're kind of without a purpose. They've lost their main goal, which was to beat Grissom in his own game. And so they start moving in different directions. Some of them start traveling. The Kersey brothers hire a charter, and they go up to Quebec, take some of the other members of the group up to the Gaspé Peninsula. They look at gannets and seabirds and are there for a couple of weeks, have a great time. Allan Cruickshank decides he's now going to make it his goal to photograph every bird in North America, be the first person to do that. And there you see Cruickshank with this camera and Hickey in this little boat. Cruickshank, actually, he was very attractive. He actually was offered a role in Hollywood as Tarzan. He turned it down. He didn't want to be president of a company. He didn't want to go to Hollywood. His goal was to photograph all these birds. So he's off doing his own thing. Tory Peterson meets a man who was an editor, a man named William Vogt, and introduces him to birding. And Vogt was a botanist, and so he trains or shows Peterson flowers and such, and Peterson shows him birds. And Vogt, who's an editor, says, you know a lot about birds. Why don't you write a book? And so Peterson gets that idea planted in his mind. He had read this novel by Ernest Thompson Seton about two little savages, about if you look carefully at a bird's markings close up, you can spot them far away. Sounded like a great idea, so I tried it, and it worked. Better to identify a living bird at a distance than a dead one in your hand. And in 1934 publishes his Field Guide to the Birds, sets the standard for field ornithology as expertise in rapid identification of birds. So Peterson's found his new purpose in life, and essentially that becomes his purpose, writing successive editions of the Field Guide and then becoming the editor of the Peterson Field Guide series. But he says field birding is an absorbing game and it has little scientific value. It's the most absorbing game. Old timers minimize the scientific value of this type of bird work. Truly, it has but little. Peterson's goal was seeing as many birds as you could, whether it's in a single day, over the course of a year, or over the course of a lifetime. Very much in a competitive spirit, birding as a sport. And this is what I call Peterson's perspective. The high-pressure birding techniques were developed by the Bronx lads, and Griscom was our god. These techniques were then brought to the four corners of the land by the BCBC group in places such as San Diego, Cocoa Beach, Freeport, and elsewhere. As the boys grow up and as they go out into different parts of the country, they take Peterson's techniques, they disseminate them, they become his disciples. And in the meantime, Peterson remains Ludlow Griscom's most fervent disciple. He never has anything bad to say about Griscom. He just, like he says, Griscom was our god. And it's Peterson's perspective that's prevailed in virtually every account of the Bronx County Bird Club. World of Watchers by Joe Kastner, the article that I referenced by John Farron, The Bronx Age, and other books. This notion of Peterson, that listing was what it was all about, as the legacy of the Bronx County Bird Club took hold, and that it was a revolution, that this transition from shotgun collecting of birds to field glass observation of birds. And there's a large amount of truth to that it is the ultimate legacy of the Bronx County Bird Club. But Hickey had a different take. He was interviewed for this book, a biography of Griscom, and as it says, he reiterated Peterson's description of the role that Griscom played. Hickey, however, suggested that this influence was not always of a positive sort. He noted that Griscom inspired a sporting interest in birds, leading to a list-crazy focus, and that many young men under Griscom's sway experienced difficulty going beyond the field identification stage to concentrate on more broadly based scientific work. I think he's thinking of Peterson there, that Peterson was not willing to go beyond identification into science. And this is the great paradox, the poorly defined area of overlap between ornithology and sport birding. What this entails is Hickey and a second revolution in American birding that the Bronx County Bird Club was involved in, and most particularly Hickey himself. So Hickey goes to New York University, birding takes a back seat. He's very busy. He had bad experience in high school, and he decided when he gets to college, he's going to pour himself into it and do everything he can. He becomes the class president. He's with the U-Book, the Literary Society. He becomes a track and field runner. For a while, he was like number 10 in the world in terms of the mile. And he became a track coach. After he graduated in 1930, he coaches track, a job that he loved. So that, and the New York Times, there's this photo about how he was named the best all-round man. He briefly dabbled in bird banding. He got to know some leading bird banders. Albert Cross was one of them. And Cross says, have you done anything lately in the bird banding line? And he had tried to band Kentucky warblers in New York State. And he spent a hell of a lot of time traveling all over Westchester County. And he could only find 2 of them. And he got really disappointed by that. Time was lost in finding nests and traveling to widely scattered locations. So he gave it up. He abandoned it. It was just too much work, and he didn't have the time. He visited the Grand Canyon. I'm not sure how he got out there. I suspect he hitchhiked. And he talks in his field notebook about the effect on seeing it for the first time as something which defies adequate description. Nothing can make a proud man feel more insignificant. A sense there that there's this grandeur in nature that he's missing out on because he's been so focused on listing birds. And of course, ironically, since I had a degree in history, I was going nowhere. I sometimes relate to that. Fortunately, I haven't had that experience. But he took a job. He lost his job as a coach because of a budget cut. This was in the depths of the Depression. The only thing he could do after looking and looking and looking was get a job with Con Edison as a salesman, a job he despised. And he particularly despised it because there was no place he could go up in the company unless he was to get a degree in electrical engineering, which he didn't want to do. So he was going nowhere. And as he said, I was really fed up with the list-chasing horizons of most bird clubs. My list of the birds I've seen is bigger than yours. The rare bird I found is rarer than the rare bird you found. And Peterson says Hickey had gone through the usual cycle with his field glass and little white checklist of birds. The law of diminishing returns had set in, and his zealous interest lapsed. He still went on a few field trips, but it looked as though another follower of the birding cult had been lost. And Hickey, who was fond of writing about himself in the third person, and this is from his book, a guide, actually from an article he wrote, I've learned reading his stuff that a lot of what he's writing about in the third person is really him. So this, I think, is what he was going through. Let us pause and frankly consider the amateur ornithologist's handicaps. He's out of doors, for instance, only on weekends. Enters the field with little or no technical training. Got scanty knowledge of literature. He sees little of significance in the behavior and distribution of the most common species. He holds firmly to his one bit of knowledge. He can identify birds, and he keeps on compiling a list. Yet beneath his pursuit of the life bird and the rarity, there burns a sense of dignity for his efforts, and a sense that professional ornithologists don't appreciate that. And this, that amateurs are not regarded well. So I think that's all moiling around in Hickey's mind in the early 1930s. And this wonderful 2 lines from a poem he wrote, "Oh, I'm fairly content with the state I'm in, but I'm not the bird I might have been." It's a poem about blackbirds. And he talks about how blackbirds find a mate and they find half a dozen mates. And he's got friends who are married and he doesn't. And, his life is going nowhere. He's not the bird he might have been. Well, he starts visiting the library at the American Museum of Natural History and also at the Audubon Society. And he starts looking at British literature. This is actually a quote from Australia, but it's very pertinent. Here, there may not be an appreciation of the change in the type of field study of birds which has taken place in recent years in England, a change which is beginning to steal over the face of field ornithology. Britain was becoming the place in the world for field ornithology, and not field ornithology in terms of identifying birds, but field ornithology in a sense of understanding how birds lived, what they're all about. And so Hickey sweet charms the librarian at the Audubon Society into letting him borrow the entire run of British birds beginning in 1907, which he reads in a subway going back and forth. A sidebar, the librarian was a woman named Margaret Brooks. And it took Hickey a little while to realize this until he finally made the connection. But he realized he was out bird banding in Connecticut in the late 1920s, and he saw a woman and her daughter. They were interested because he was holding an owl in his hand, like the photograph that was there. And he showed them the owl, and they talked a little bit. The daughter was Margaret Brooks. Years later, he would become Hickey's wife. So when he's reading British birds, he's also courting the woman who would be his wife and will ultimately be Susie Hickey's mother. He also reads this book, The Art of Bird Watching, a British approach to the scientific studies of the living bird. It's all about systematizing bird watching, that you get together groups of people, you've got agendas, research agendas to pursue, and it's all about connecting with the living bird. So this is great. He's loving this stuff that he's reading, but the trouble is he doesn't know how to go about putting this into practice. And then his life is changed by meeting Ernst Mayr. As Hickey says, the greatest influence on me was Uncle Ernst. He revealed to me the joys of scientific research. And Mayr says, I love Joe dearly. He much contributed to my feeling at home in the United States. He was a born teacher. Ernst Mayr was an emigre from Germany, came over in the late 1920s to take a position with the American Museum of Natural History. He was a few years older than Hickey, but not by much. And you see him there with the staff of the ornithology department. And down below is his mentor, a man named Edwin Stresemann. Mayr came over and brought with him a literal Rolodex of contacts in ornithology. He knew everybody who was anybody in Europe. He knew everybody who was anybody who was on their way to becoming anybody in North America. And he goes to the Museum of Natural History. He meets Hickey. Hickey says, why don't you come out birding with us? And so they start birding together, and they become great friends. And Mayr perceives that there's little interest in breeding biology or in ornithological problems generally, but this may be changed through slow education. You see there's Mayr going out with Hickey and some of the others on a birding trip. Mayr invites Hickey to help him count roosting starlings in New York City. And he says, I'm delighted about your enthusiasm for the starling investigation. And they spend a lot of time counting starlings, looking at what the directions are coming from. And Mayr decides that the best way to get young people interested in ornithology, young men, was to hold ornithological seminars for them, like graduate seminars. When I mention this to my new friends, Hickey and the others, they encouraged me to start an ornithological seminar through the Alliance Society to review the literature. And Hickey says, this was the turning point in my life. He's got a mentor who is telling him and the other is about the literature, getting them engaged, getting them involved, getting them to see that ornithology is an intellectual pursuit rather than an emotional pursuit where you're just listing birds. And it changed Hickey's life. They form an a fieldwork committee at the Linnean Society, and they begin pursuing field ornithology. And again, in the sense of understanding how birds live. Mayer had the Germanic point of view that everybody should have a problem to work on. That's where I got started, where I started to get ornithological ideas, as did other members of the group. And you see Hickey he goes back to banding birds. He's with a puffin there, and Cruickshank is helping him with projects. And he absorbs Mayer's greatest lesson. This is Hickey saying, the great problems in ornithology depend for their solution on a core of observers working together in common purpose. It's not an individual going out to get the biggest list. It's a group of people working together to solve a common problem. And led by Hickey, who now becomes kind of the de facto leader of the Bronx County Bird Club, they begin working on cooperative research problems. Owls, peregrine falcons, herring gulls. They become the first birders in America to use celluloid bands to monitor birds. And they're having great fun understanding how birds live. Interestingly, the one person of the Bronx County Bird Club who doesn't take any part in this is Peterson. He just didn't want to be involved in it. And the former track coach, Hickey, begins coaching younger birders. He goes out to the Bronx Zoo, to other places, and begins mentoring young birders like this group, the Sussex Bird Club, that formed. And they loved how he would take them out and listen to them and help them identify things. And he'd point out things about birds, but he'd also talk about conservation and wildlife management. And through Mayer, Hickey goes to a cocktail party in 1937, meets Aldo Leopold, of his time the foremost figure in terms of conservation and natural history. And Hickey tells him about how our fieldwork committee believes that the scientific pursuit of studies in field ornithology constitutes a lasting source of interest. We exist to make the amateur aware of the tremendous amount of opportunity and fun in field investigation. And Hickey says, can you use me? Can you hire me? Can you bring me out to Wisconsin? Well, it took a few years, but in 1940, Hickey got there. He wound up doing his master's degree under Leopold, and he wrote this dissertation, A Guide to Bird Watching, which became a book, A Guide to Bird Watching. And William Vogt says, for God's sakes, don't call it an introduction to field ornithology. It may be that, but certainly nobody's going to buy it if you call it Introduction to Field Ornithology. I offer The Living Bird as a title. But the idea is this becomes the manual, the handbook for popular field ornithology, for amateurs to follow Hickey's example and do what he did, engage in cooperative projects, and more importantly, discover the pleasures of bird study, adventures in bird counting, the romance of bird banding, the lure of migration watching, exploration in bird distribution, observing the wonders of creation as they are expressed in the most common phenomena, going back to his time at the Grand Canyon, being awed by the wonders of nature. Each of us has a chance to do this, to observe the wonders of creation. So there's Hickey. He leaves in 1943 after he graduates. He goes to work at the Patuxent Laboratory. He goes to University of Michigan, studies under Jocelyn Van Tyne, and in 1947, Leopold recruits him to come back to University of Wisconsin as his assistant, looking to groom him to be his eventual successor. 4 months later, Leopold dies. And Hickey suddenly is thrust into the role of becoming the chair of the wildlife management program and teaching, and he loved it. He taught there for 38 years, mentored hundreds and hundreds of students. And he retired in 1977, and the retirement party was at Aldo Leopold's shack. And there he is with Irving Cassoy, a little handwritten note, Irving Cassoy, my oldest friend from the South Bronx. He always cherished the relationships he'd built. And a year later, the last official meeting of the Bronx County Bird Club was held in Fort Myers, Florida. Cassoy was there, Fred Ruff, Peterson, Richard Kersey, Joe Hickey. They had a little symposium, they gave papers, and they celebrated one another. 4 months later, Cassoy was dead. A couple months later, Ruff died, Kersey died, and it was down to Peterson and Hickey. And this is the last photograph of the two of them together at the Audubon Society Award dinner in 1982. And you see Ernst Mayr there and Hickey engaged in a conversation, and Peterson kind of standing back and kind of looking in. To me, that speaks volumes about where they were at in their lives. I think Peterson, for all that he had accomplished, envied Hickey for becoming the full-fledged watcher that he never had. And he writes a letter to Hickey. I count my blessings that I was able to know the Bronx County Bird Club, particularly you, Cassoy, Crookie. Thing I missed recently is the healthy mix of the advanced amateur and the professional or academic. It was a bittersweet moment. By the numbers, birding as sport beat birding as science, hands down. Peterson's field guide, 8 million copies and counting. Hickey's Guide to Bird Watching, 40,000 copies. So if you go strictly by the numbers, who had the more powerful legacy? Hickey would agree, bird watching in the British sense of the cooperative term failed here. I argued that bird watching provided more lasting satisfaction than listing, but bird listing is far bigger now than it was when I was a boy. So if somebody tells you today he's a bird watcher, he's probably a lister. He said that in 1976, 50 years later, I think it was ahead of his time, because we're in an environment in which amateur participation in cooperative science, field ornithology, is thriving. Things like Project Feeder Watch, the North American Breeding Bird Survey, the Great Backyard Bird Count, all those things underscore the potency of amateurs working with scientists on cooperative field projects that can enhance our understanding of birds. I think Hickey, if he were alive today, would understand that the debt that's owed to him for setting that in motion. And this wonderful quote from Scott Wiedensaul: the pendulum may be starting to swing the other way, back to birding's roots, to bird watching in the original sense of the word, where the bird exists not as a symbol or tick mark or a challenge, not as a state record or as a can you top this vagrant, or at least not solely as these things, a path in which the thrill of the sport is tempered by a celebration of the creature that makes it all possible. This small, contained miracle that is a bird. I think both Peterson and Hickey understood that, but in different ways. But we owe a great debt to both of them, the last members of the Bronx County Bird Club. So thank you, and happy birding, whether you bird as a scientist or as an enthusiast. Either way, I hope you have many happy birding adventures. Thank you.
We're going to have to give you Thank you so much. Hey, Rebecca, I forget how to turn this microphone on. One thing I did forget to mention before, so John, you had mentioned you couldn't be here in November. So Janet Peterson graciously, she came and she spoke about birding in Cameroon. She's had quite a lifetime of birding, being married to a husband who worked for the government. So anyway, if you missed Janet's lecture, where is that note? Okay, so she's going to be presenting that lecture again on January 24th at the Georgetown Library at 11 a.m. So if you missed that lecture in November, you're welcome to go see her again. But anyone who's on chat, please feel free to enter your questions and I'll check and I will share them. But is there anyone here in the room? And anyone who speaks, please speak right into the microphone. So,
John, thank you. That was very interesting. I'm curious, what got you interested or prompted you to put this all together, to follow Hickey and everything so closely?
That's a great question. I study history of science at Ohio State, but really not much natural history. And I've been a lifelong birder, but it wasn't until Lynn and I went out to Wyoming in 2008, and we were out there for 7 years, and I went one day to a meeting of the local chapter of the Audubon Society, Meadowlark Audubon, and thought, this is a bunch of old guys. This isn't a very exciting group. And then I thought, well, maybe I should go and see if I can help. And so I went to a meeting, and I remember saying, I'm interested in joining a club. How can I help? And there was a pause, and somebody said, do you want to be president? And I said, no, but I'll tell you what, I'll be vice president, and I'll edit your newsletter. So I wound up editing a newsletter, and it gave me the opportunity to do something which I hadn't done, which was creative writing about my experiences as a birder, but also about people who watch birds. And that was what got me interested in the history of birds. And it was back about that time, I'd redone the Buffalo Bill Museum and was looking for something to do. And I got interested in Aldo Leopold, actually, and his interest in wildlife research. And that led me to look at his papers, which are online. And I kept running across Hickey, and then began thinking about mentoring in birding and the role that mentorship plays in educating birders and in how mentors take their birding knowledge to different places. So I had this idea to do a project called Under Their Wing, which was going to be a study of mentoring in bird watching, and I may still do that, but that's what got me interested in Hickey, because he had trained so many people, hundreds of students. And so I was reading actually a biography of Peterson, where I ran across a reference to Susie Nels, who had helped the woman who wrote that biography. And that's why I contacted Susie, and the rest is history. So,
Well, it's very fascinating. Thank you. I love the comparison between Peterson and Hickey.
thank you.
Great.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
I spent a lot of time in the 60s at Van Cortlandt Park and Pelham Lake Park. I got some great life birds back then, barn owl, sword owl, long-eared owl, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I want to put a plug in for you talk about Allan Cruickshank. I want to put a plug in for Helen, because most people never don't know who Helen is or was. Helen was his wife. She was an excellent birder, like himself. She was an excellent bird photographer as well. And if anybody wants to Google her, look her up, you'll find out all about Helen. Just put a plug in for her.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I think you're going to pick the top three figures. Allan Cruickshank would be the third one. And he, as you said, he became a very noted bird photographer. I think he helped advance the field of bird photography as a hobby. A lot of people followed into that because of him. He also probably was the most fervent advocate of the high pressure, intensive preparations for the bird counts. There are stories about him going down to Florida and whipping people into shape and pissing them off because they would be all excited about their records, and he would say, well, I have questions about your identification. And he'd throw them out. And anyway, a great legacy. Thank you for mentioning that. I appreciate that.
Any other questions here in the room? Do I have anything online? Well, John, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you do this.
Thank you.
talk
I
for us.
appreciate it. And again, good luck to all of you. This past year I had some medical issues which kept me from being much less active. I'm feeling much better, thankfully. I meet with my neurologist tomorrow, and I look forward to spending many more opportunities with the Sussex Bird Club, Lynn and I both, in that regard. And so we'll go forward together. Be well. Take care. Thank you again. Oh, yes. Sanctuary in Florida named after him? Absolutely, yes, it is. Yes. The question is whether the Cruickshank Sanctuary in, was it near Cocoa Beach, I think, is named for Cruickshank. It's actually named for both Allan and his wife Helen, who in her own right was a birder. I should say too, Margaret Brooks Hickey, Joe's wife and Susie's mother, was a birder in her own regard, was very active with the Audubon Society, really didn't get the credit she deserved. She also became the editor of Bird Lore for many years, and she was Hickey's inspiration. She was the one who convinced him, if you're going to marry me, you got to write that goddamn book. And essentially, on their honeymoon, Hickey started writing the book. And I think it's very touching that after she passed away, it was obviously a big blow, but he put together Margaret Brooks Hickey's field notes, birding notes. She had done a lot of studies, banding studies of blue jays, and he put them together and published an article about that. And I think it's a testament to how deeply he loved her and admired her for what she did and what she had done for him. So thank you again. Anything else? Any other questions? All right. Be well. Take care.